From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Current Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Jonathan Sanford, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another edition of the show. And I'm so grateful to be back for yet another program this week. And I hope you enjoyed last week's episode and the last parts 1 and 2, I should say, because they certainly were a treat talking to Andrew himself. That being said, if you enjoyed the episodes, because who the hell wouldn't down the line when this really blows up like Joe Rogan or something of that nature, you're going to say, oh my gosh, I should have subscribed. So do all that fun jazz. It certainly helps the algorithm, as they tell you to say, for this sort of operation. Nevertheless, on to this week's edition. Although it may not be game time, it is show time, which means another brand new episode for a new week, and that means another exceptional guest. This week, by the way of the Yellowhammer State and up Interstate 10 to the Bayou City, this generation's Pepper Simmons, Jonathan Sanford, aka the voice of the Houston Rockets, humbly graces us with his presence this week. Mr. Sanford, we thank you for joining us today.
Well, first of all, if you compare me whatsoever to Pepper Simmons, I feel pretty doggone good about that introduction. I appreciate that.
Well, of course, why not? It's someone who is one of the catalysts to help provide top tier entertainment with my favorite team is always someone who deserves the utmost professionalism and outright best intro. Speaking of my favorite team, the Rockets, who you worked for, and I recently talked to, a few months ago, I talked to someone who you might have worked for. Yeah, you probably had worked with and know, Bill Schoening over at the San Antonio Spurs. And, he's been doing this for many decades, similar as yourself have been doing it for a while. And I talked to him about how he's dealt with the last few years, professionally speaking. And I know you sort of came back into the fold of PA announcing in 2021 with the Rockets. So for you now to sort of experience the tail end of it all professionally, what's it been like to now go into another season post all of that and you're back in the saddle in front of everybody?
Well, for me, it's been such an incredible experience to go from San Antonio there and working with guys like Bill Schoening to coming over here to Houston, and Matt Thomas and I, we became familiar with each other during his time when he was the PA here for the Houston Rockets, but the play-by-play guy on the radio for the Rockets. And anytime they visit San Antonio, it had an opportunity to visit with him. But, sometimes life takes you on a journey that you just never expect. You don't ever dream that you'll end up doing certain things in life. Now, doing PA in the NBA was a childhood dream. It started out when I was very, very young. But the idea that, when I was in San Antonio, that one day I'd be sitting in Houston at that very unique table there on the sidelines of the Toyota Center, just didn't seem like even remotely something that would happen. It just, for NBA PA announcers, you're lucky if you get one opportunity in this world and in that brotherhood. And so for me to end up here in Houston has been really a dream come true in a multifaceted way.
Well, I know it started all the way back to that 1993 playoff series in terms of P announcing with the Supersonics and the Suns, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yes.
then there was another scenario where you brought a television screen to a camping trip, which we'll get to
Yeah.
momentarily. I want to mention, and this is the last aspect of the first question I just asked, but during this time, hopefully it's given us all an opportunity to reflect on ourselves, things we didn't know prior about oneself, which is kind of redundant, me asking the way I did. But for you, what's one thing Jonathan Sanford learned about himself during the last 3 years that he didn't know prior?
That I was capable of getting back to the level that I had been able to achieve in San Antonio and even grow beyond that. When you are in a franchise like the Spurs and you're part of an NBA championship and you have those opportunities to call such great series that I was fortunate to do, and then you walk away, you think, well, will I ever get back to that level personally and professionally? Will I ever feel like I am at that level again? And really, that first season for me here in Houston, I didn't really feel like I had gotten there yet. I felt like I was still not quite myself. But last year, I really started to feel like, hey, not only did I get back to where I was, but I started to see ways that I was even better than I was in San Antonio, which for me, that's what I wanted. I didn't want Houston to get the subpar version of Jonathan
Sure.
Sanford. I wanted them to get the very best version of Jonathan Sanford, even better than what I was able to give the folks in San Antonio. Because personally and professionally, that's what you want to be. You always want to grow. You always
Mhm.
want to stretch your abilities, and never do you just want to rest on what you did 2 seasons ago or 3 seasons ago. You want to be the very best version of yourself as an announcer every year, like coming in this season. That's my goal. I want to be
Yeah.
even better than I was last season. And so I have that drive, and I'm going to continue to have that drive. And I think the only thing that surprised me, like I said, was that at some point last season, I went, it's really here and it's really
Yeah.
happening, and I'm really finding myself in a way I didn't think was possible anymore.
Well, and certainly this upcoming season compared to the last few years is certainly an impactful season that's going to hold a lot of value for all those across the board that work within and next to the organization, as you very well know. Particularly speaking of this past off season, I want to go back as far back in the time as we can, all the way back to Jasper, Alabama, where young Jonathan got his start, and it's well known. You mentioned other interviews, of course, and if no one knows it, it's sort of shocking in terms of world geography or local geography that and Alabama, of course, has no professional teams, no NBA, no baseball, no football, but of course, there's college stuff. So for you to have this dream of being a PA announcer, like the guys who worked for the Chicago Bulls, I just mentioned Mr. Simmons. How do you remember finding that dream? And was that something of a shock for you, seeing as there was no professional local stuff to look up to?
Well, really, the only connection that I had with PA announcers as a little child, maybe 5, 6 years old, was going to Legion Field in Birmingham
Yeah,
and watching the Iron Bowl, Alabama versus Auburn, and hearing the PA guy there in Legion Field and thinking, wow, that's kind of cool. Uh, that was my first real moment that consciously I heard this voice and thought that really is a difference maker and the atmosphere of a game. But then through the years, once the NBA for me really became more of a thing in my life was during that run of the late 80s and the early 90s and then the Jordan era. And really when NBC came along and NBC started showing the finals, and you had Ray Clay, the announcer for the Chicago Bulls, and you had NBC actually showing the player introductions, and Chicago put a lot of work into making that production something special, and Ray's voice just set a memory for many announcers. I'm not the only guy that says, "Hey, he is somebody who inspired me." There's so many PA guys around the league today that would tell you the same thing, but there was just something about that time period that he and the Chicago Bulls kind of made me think of it as something completely different than my mind had ever imagined it to be. And it was in 97 that I was like, hey, I can't wait any longer. I want to
sure.
find a way to get involved in this in some way. And really, the only way you can start in this business is to start at the very bottom
Yeah,
and start to grind and start to get as many opportunities as you can. And for me, being in Alabama, thinking, yeah, well, the ceiling would be being the voice of the Alabama Crimson Tide. And hey, I would have been perfectly fine with that, but there would always have been a part of me that would have been like, man, what would it have been like to be courtside at the scoring table with that mic in front of me with 18,000
yeah,
people reacting intimately to the calls? There would always have been that part of me. And the good news is I married a Texan, and marrying a Texan got me here to Texas. As I like to tell people, I got here as quick as I could. No disrespect to my home state of Alabama. I love them. But the opportunities here are far greater than any opportunity I was going to have in terms of the ability to be a part of the NBA. And even though we moved here, still it seemed like such a far fetched dream.
sure.
When we first moved to Houston, in 2003 and I was announcing in the area, people would hear me and they go, well, why aren't you announcing for the Astros or the Texans or the Rockets? And I would just say, man, I really don't know how to
Yeah,
get an opportunity with that. I'm just kind of isolated from that. And I loved what I was doing, and it was enjoyable to give back a lot of high school stuff. And it was great to give back to the kids and to enjoy, those moments with them on Friday nights or during basketball season. But it just seems still like a far fetched reality
sure.
for me. So Going all the way back to Alabama, that was kind of the deal. Like it didn't, even though it was a dream, and even though it was a passion, I wasn't quite sure if really it was in the cards for me.
I remember reading that or listening to an interview you had done where you talked about you got experience doing some announcing in high school. Compared to, that aspect, and then once you started doing it professionally for these high school teams in Houston and Texas, how did you remember handling that process of preparing for the event, psyching yourself up, getting ready for it, and then looking years down the road of now how you're experiencing it as a professional?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because for me, it didn't matter if there were 50 people in the gym, or 5,000 or 15,000. I always approached the preparation exactly the same. And to be quite honest with you, I think that's what made a difference when it came to finally getting in front of some people who actually were decision makers, that had some control over who was going to be their announcer for their NBA team. Was the fact that it didn't matter to me whether it was a tiny gym in Liberty, Texas, with maybe 150 people in it, or an arena 5 times that size. It didn't matter to me because I was always going to approach the preparation to an absolute T. Every I dotted, every T crossed, every name as best as you can understood and know how to pronounce it and give it just the right inflection, and making that connection with the fans, whether it's 50 or 100 or 15,000. I was always very calculated on trying to figure out how was the best way to reach that particular group of fans, whether it's your home fans or even the away fans. There's some
Yeah.
gamesmanship in that you certainly think about, and you always want to keep it respectful. But for me, it was all about going into each situation with the same mindset. Again, whether it's a small arena or a large arena.
Well, I want to mention that the size of the crowd, the size of the performance that you're working towards, and a lot of the sports and news media members in my area in New England that I've spoken to, you can't always start off big time. Now, of course, if you get that, you're sure as heck lucky and very fortunate to get
Right.
to that position. But most start small. I had a guy on a few weeks ago that I sort of know who got to start up in Bangor, Maine, a small market as a
Yeah.
sportscaster, and now he's the sports director at one of the local stations here in Rhode Island where I live. And for you, how accustomed or how ready were you for that in terms of starting out small and doing as many gigs as you can, regardless of the size? Was that something that you were acceptant of, or was that something that you learned to appreciate as you went down that road before San Antonio?
So I'll put it to you like this. I thought I was ready. I really thought I was ready after all those years of announcing in front of, regardless of different sized crowds. In my mind, I was so self-convinced that I could sit down at that scoring table in front of 18,500 people and do just as confident of a job there as I did in front of the smaller crowds. But the reality is, the moment is so much bigger, and it was a humbling experience for me that first season in San Antonio. You know, I kind of approached that first season in San Antonio like, hey, let me just kind of fly under the radar here for a little bit. Let me the previous guy had a great reputation, everybody loved him. So let me just come in here and not grab a lot of attention too quickly. And then as that season went on, I began to add my taste and feel to things. And by the third quarter of the season, then finally it was like, hey, the speed of the game, not a problem.
Sure.
The atmosphere, not a problem. And confidence was certainly something that wasn't a problem at that point, where I felt like, hey, I can kind of put my own stamp on things and not have to worry too much. And for me, I think that was part of the Spurs mentality a little
Sure.
bit, and so that fit me very well at that point in my life, that I had not been given that opportunity before. I was a no name in terms of the NBA PA announcing, community. So coming in there and that particular team and that organization, the way they view things, I think was a pretty good fit for me because, again, I didn't come in right away like, hey, look at me, everybody. It was just kind of like, hey, let me get in here and hopefully get some respect built between myself and this organization. And then when it's time to turn it on and show what we can do, then that moment was not going to be too big for me.
This may be a redundant question, so apologies in advance. You kind of just mentioned how you thought you were ready right away for the big time in the NBA. But I'm interested if there was ever a moment for you, because I've asked this to others as well in the media industry, where they join these small markets and they get tested and they straddle the area of, do I want to do this? Is this for me? Or this is for me. I don't care. I'll throw me into the fire. For you, was there a moment that you remember tested you early on in your career that made you almost regret going that way? Or was it a moment where it was sort of a smooth sail ever since, where you're enjoying the ride and you will take on any opportunity?
So, in my interview process, one of the guys that I was interviewing with the Spurs, I think that was his concern that, hey, you haven't had this experience. Are you going to come in here and it's going to get to you and it's going to be too hard for you? Is it going to be too much of a mountain to climb for you? But in my mind, like I said, I was self confident enough to know that whatever was thrown my way, I would find a way to handle it in that moment. And there were certainly some times early in that season in San Antonio where I was tested, and thankfully, without going into too many details, there was one individual there in the San Antonio Spurs organization that kind of had his finger on a lot of what I did and a lot of what other people did within a game night experience. And from what I was told, like he didn't have a lot of nice things to say about other people from time to time. And I'll never get in that first quarter of the season at halftime, him walking down and leaning over the scoring table and saying something positive, and the guy that was beside me, he was like, "Wow, that never happens. Congratulations!" And so that really helped. I mean,
Sure.
because it let me know that hey, at least I'm not drowning here.
Yeah.
I have my head above water and I'm making progress, which for me was, a big transition when you go from high school and junior college, some college ball to, that big, arena.
Well, it's always good to be on the good side of someone who's very critical of people's work, because if not, then you're going to be gone as soon as possible. In listening to interviews, I marveled at the fact of your progression and the track you went through to get to the Spurs and the Rockets, and it was almost a pinball machine type of thing where one thing led to the next, this led to
Yeah.
that. Jalen Hurts' father somehow was in the equation of one of those teams, and I don't know if it was the Spurs or the Rockets that led from working as the PA announcer for Jalen Hurts' father's football team, and sort of
No, that
describe
was
the process.
so moved to Channelview, Texas in 2003, and Avron Hurts, who's Jalen's father, uh, Avron's the coach there at Channelview High School, and I got linked up with him. They needed a PA announcer for their high school football team, and the Jalen Hurts was just a little kid at that point in
Yeah,
time. I never would have dreamed at that moment, seeing him as a little kid playing on the sidelines, that he would end up being, who he is today, right? Playing in
yeah,
a Super Bowl last year. But having that first connection, that was the first person, Avron Hurts, here in the state of Texas, was the first person here in this state that said, "Hey, come on, let's do something together."
yeah.
And so I always look back, positive in terms of that time there. I had, with Channelview High School and announcing there for them, and it didn't lead right away to anything, big time, but it was just that experience in the state of Texas. The first time anybody in the state of Texas said, "Hey, you sound pretty good. Let's give you a shot." So for me, that'll always be a positive thing as I look back on it.
And then how soon after that did the independent school district PA announce stuff for the and then the softball thing championships as well? How soon after was that stuff?
So I kept announcing high school ball all over Houston, whether it was in Channelview or up in Tomball and Magnolia West High School, which was a brand new high school back in that period around 2007. And then we ended up living over in Liberty, Texas, and Liberty's a tiny town. I mean, really like a one red light kind of place. But the Liberty Panthers, the football, basketball, baseball, softball, I was announcing all of it while we were there. And my wife grew up in Austin, Texas, and in 2011, she got a job offer there in Austin teaching. She's a music teacher and plays the oboe, if you know what the oboe is. And all those years, wherever I went, she never rebuffed. She never was like, "Hey, I wanted to stay here." Wherever I got a job opportunity, she was always very giving and
Yeah.
gracious about it and would follow me. And when she got that offer, it was about the time, here, give you a little background. You remember the show Friday Night Lights?
Yeah.
It was toward the end of the run of Friday Night Lights. And there was the scenes there at the end where Coach Taylor's wife gets a job offer in Pennsylvania, which is going to take him away from Texas high school football. But in the end, he finally is like, you know what? It's time. You followed me. It's my time to give back to you. And it was amazing that we were kind of going through that same situation.
Yeah.
So we ended up moving to Austin. And that's how I ended up in Austin getting connected with the UIL, that is the University uh, Interscholastic League, which governs all high school sports and fine arts here in the state of Texas. So it was through them and through Austin Independent School District that my voice started being heard in and around the Austin area, and that was in late 2011 to early 2012. By mid 2012, though, my voice had gotten heard by folks from the Spurs, which
Yeah.
it's a long story. I won't share it all here. There's been other interviews that have gone into detail, but the right people were able to hear me at the right time and say, "Hey, you need to apply for this job." And I did, and was fortunate enough to get my foot in the door with the Spurs. And then 2013 was my first full season with them. I spent a year in the D League, as it was known back then. Now
Yeah.
it's known as the G League. And then 2013, 2014 was my first full season there in San Antonio. I went to an NBA Finals that year, won the NBA Finals with alongside the team. I didn't win anything, but deal announcing.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a short version of a
Sure.
very, like you say, a pinball situation, because there were moments in there where no way is this happening.
Yeah.
It just seemed so crazy that it happened so quickly.
And I'm sure for yourself, although you always hope to be recognized or someone, sees your talent, but a moment where, one person is like, oh, listen to this guy's performance, and then goes to this thing, and the next thing, and that thing. And that was another interesting point, how you got the Spurs job, because somebody was going for it and had it, and then you
Yeah.
suddenly find out that, oh, this person no longer it's not set in stone yet. You apply for the position and you're getting it. And most people dream of calling an NBA Finals. You in your first full season with the team called the historic 13-14 NBA Finals season 10 years ago this year. And for you, I'm sure to be your first season doing this was like, how the hell did I get in this scenario? So for
So
you, no, yeah, go for it.
a little detail that I maybe haven't told before. It's hard to remember, but so when they sent me down, or sent me up to the D League there in Austin, the Austin Spurs, they were known then as the Austin Toros. We went to the D League Finals that year, playing against the Santa Cruz Warriors. Now, as well, because the Spurs are in the playoffs, um, the Spurs had asked me to come down. It was in the series against Golden State. There in the playoffs that year, in the 2012-2013 playoff run. Barry Tom, who, as you mentioned, was the guy that had been kind of the shoe-in for the Spurs job
Yeah.
all along, and eventually, had it that season. They asked me to come down and be ready to jump behind the mic. I mean, can you imagine this? Like, he was not feeling well and was losing his voice, and they call me up and say, "Hey, we want you to be at these playoff games just in case." And so, like, I'm sitting there awaiting that it's possible that any moment during these games I could get pressed into service, which that would have been crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if talk about a moment being too big for you. I don't know if it would have been or not, but just looking back on it now, it seems like it would have been. But I was there, and I was ready to go as much as I could be under that circumstance. But I don't think I've ever shared that with anybody in any of these interviews before, but that was something that was kind of cool and kind of chaotic at the
Yeah.
same time, right? Because here I was, just finished up the D League season, and had a good run there, and a lot of good experience within the organization and getting to know the folks. And like RC Buford would come up to those games up in at the Cedar Park Center there in Austin, and got to know him. In fact, one night we had a young lady who was scheduled to sing the national anthem, and something happened with her, and all of a sudden she wasn't going to be singing, and so they were like, "Who can sing it?" And here I have a mic in my hand, and so I end up singing the national anthem. It's on the broadcast and everything, and um, finished up at halftime. I was like walking in the back, and RC Buford came up to me and goes, "Man, you can do everything, can't you?" I said, "Well, you can do most anything when you're pressed into service, right?" And
Sure.
so that was kind of a cool experience to get to meet him and work with him a little bit up there. And I think that kind of helped me in that next season, because it wasn't like I was put in that seat and had zero experience with
Sure.
an NBA atmosphere. G League, D League is not quite the same, but at least it was kind of that upward growth for me, I think.
Now, although the team, the Spurs, of course, Greg Popovich had been there for years, so that 2013-14 season, as well as the big three for that program, along with maybe a few other key players as well. That helps a lot when you have three players sharing the ball, like those three that they were there with Greg Popovich on top of the squad. At what point, though, in that season, your first full season with the team, could you tell that this season could be magical in terms of a postseason appearance?
I don't know the exact date, but there was a regular season, the second regular season matchup between the Spurs and the Miami Heat. Early season, there was a matchup between the Spurs and the Heat on the road in Miami that the Spurs got beat in. But then around, I hope I'm not wrong here, but I believe it was in March of 2014, we had the second regular season matchup with Miami, and it was, I believe it was on ESPN. And the Spurs came out that night and looked like a completely different team.
Sure.
Like they were clicking on all cylinders that night. And when that game was over, I looked at Daniel Casados, who was with me at the table at the time, and I said, "That's a good sign." Like it was at that moment where I kind of knew there's something big
Sure.
happening here because there had been doubts. I mean, the end of that 2012, 2013, the way the finals ended there, and kind of Manu's performance, people were kind of questioning him. Does he have it anymore? What's going to happen with him? And so there were some doubts from the
Sure.
external. I don't think those Spurs ever doubted their
Yeah.
ability to get back there. I don't think internally they ever doubted themselves. I think there were some questions by people outside, but it was at that moment that night where it was like there are no more questions. This group of guys is as motivated to get back to that and right the wrongs of the previous
Sure.
finals as anybody has I've ever seen, and that was kind of the moment.
How now we all know how much Greg Popovich is beloved in nationally, not just in terms of the NBA and basketball fans, but nationally as well. Is public speaking in terms of what he believes and all that stuff, but also how prestigious he is as a coach and holding his players and team accountable. The long stretch they had of playoff appearances, with the level of professionalism that he carries his team within himself, and how they operate as a core, how much of seeing that from your perspective as the PA announcer did you try to carry within your performance as an announcer, but also not just that season when you started, but throughout your career?
Well, I have a great deal of respect and love for Coach Greg Popovich. I knew coming into that situation that Coach Popovich's finger is on everything
Yeah,
within that organization, and even what I did behind the mic. There was kind of the mentality I did not want to grab his attention too soon. I did
sure.
not want to the first game him go, "Who is that nut job down there on the mic?" I wanted not to grab his attention, but there were a couple of occasions where he made some statements to me or passed a statement to me about something he wanted done differently. And hey, the way I looked at it is I watched him from time to time chew out Tim Duncan.
Yeah,
Like, and listen, if he's going to chew out Tim Duncan and Tim lets it roll off his back and goes out and performs at the level he was capable of doing, then for myself, it was kind of like, hey,
yeah,
uh, just let it roll,
sure.
learn from it and grow from it. Don't let it get you down, and it'll make you better. And I think it did. I look back on some of those situations, and I realize he knows what he's talking about.
Sure, yeah. Now, as I mentioned, you can't always predict everything. One season's not going to be similar to the next. You could win a championship. The next year, you can miss out. Players could retire, get injured for the rest of their career. How much of an eye opener was the end of that season when they won the title to then next season, the sense of things could not be the same?
Well, that offseason, there was a lot of questions. It was the first question seemed to happen quite frequently after each season is this Tim's last year, right? Is Tim Duncan coming back? And that question was answered pretty soon after the 13-14 finals and the championship that he was coming back. And almost everybody on that team was back except for, I believe the exception was Marco Bellinelli. I don't know if you remember that name or
Yeah,
not, but so many of the players are back for that next season. And thought was really in a lot of people's minds that, hey, the Spurs could just keep this train going right down the
yeah,
tracks. And that season was going really well. It was not until that last week of the regular season when we ended up dropping to third in the conference standings because we lost a couple. I think we lost that last game in New Orleans, and it dropped us to third. And so we ended up playing the Clippers in the first round of the playoffs there in the 14-15 playoffs, and we come into that series against the Clippers, and Chris Paul was just on a mission. That's all I
yeah,
can say. I mean, and we end up losing that series against the Clippers. We lost in the first round of the playoffs,
yeah,
and I remember looking around at everybody after that and thinking, we just didn't expect this. The way the team had
yeah,
performed all year, we didn't expect them to go out like that. And so there was a lot of us just kind of looking at each other and stunned thought because we thought we'd be continuing going on as deep of a run as we had the previous season because everybody was back and everybody seemed properly motivated. But the way the NBA works is, especially in these playoff series, a team can have your number, and a lot of
sure.
matchups can come into play, and things can go in a way that you just never expect. And that was the case that series with the Clippers.
Well, even you look with the Clippers, the team they are or they were when Chris Paul and Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan were on top of their game. Great teams, perennial playoff teams, but can never get into the finals, can never get past
Yeah.
the Western Conference Finals, and it's always a any given Sunday scenario where things could change. After that, the next season and two, it started to change in terms of the look of the team. Tim Duncan eventually
Yes.
retires. Tony Parker leaves. Manu Ginobili retires. Boris Dale leaves. So on and so forth. With that, coupled with someone like Kawhi coming to the team, how much of the moves like that within the organization affect your performance as the announcer, or is it just another day in office with a different look to the team?
So after that 14-15 season, the 15-16 season was like crazy. I mean, it was amazing. We were 40-1 at home.
Yeah,
Only lost one home game that entire season. Tied the Chicago Bulls for the at that time the I know Golden State has bypassed that since then, but at
yeah,
that point in time, we tied the Chicago Bulls for the most home wins in a season, and they had brought on LaMarcus Aldridge that year, and so it really felt like, all right, the LA series was kind of an aberration, but now, boom, here we go, and the number one seed humming right along, everything's great, 40-1 at home, and we got in that series with Oklahoma City, and again at the end of that series, you're going, what happened, right?
yeah,
Um, and then the next season, the 16-17 season, if you remember, we get all the way to the Western Conference Finals and just run into a buzzsaw in Golden State. And
yeah.
why gets hurt that season, right? And then the next season, which was my final season, the 17-18 season, that's when you really started feeling like, there's some momentum that's slipping. You
Yeah.
had the injury to Kawhi Leonard, and man, only played a handful of games all year. There was that kind of controversy with him throughout that season, and it was just not the typical feeling of the Spurs for what they had been for the previous several years. But to answer your question, there was no change at all in
Okay.
terms of my approach. Like I I approached each game just like I had done
Sure.
when we were getting ready to be in the NBA Finals, and it didn't change no matter what the struggle of the team may have been. My job was going to be to give each game the best atmosphere as possible and to send those fans home with a memory,
Sure.
something they could positively remember, whether it's a win or a loss. So that mentality was not going to change just because that final season things weren't quite at the Spurs level they had been in the previous years.
Do you ever put your ring on from the Spurs championship winner, or is that cased away somewhere in carbonite?
It's cased away. The I wore that championship ring for the last time. My last game in San Antonio against Golden State in that 17-18 game four. We actually won that game. It was the last game played at home of that series. They lost in game five to end the series, and Golden State advanced. But I wore that ring that day. Did not know it was going to be my last game. We'd been contemplating my future and what we were gonna do as a family, but um, that is the last time I wore that ring. I'm not going to wear it in Houston. I guarantee. I'm
No,
not going to
yeah,
show up to the Toyota Center wearing a Spurs championship
yeah,
ring. It's hidden away, and I'm grateful to have it. It'll be passed down to my kids and hopefully their kids and their kids' kids one day, and maybe they'll ask the question, "Well, what's this all about?"
yeah.
And maybe they'll learn the story. I hope so.
Eventually.